Check one. Can I get attention, please? Thank you.
Okay, I hope everybody is caffeinated and ready to continue on with the morning. Dr. Wadowski is going to chair the next session, but before he takes over, I wanted to make a couple of remarks. The first is, hopefully you'll notice on our rotating slides, now CCSAW has a Twitter feed, a Twitter account, and so please follow us on Twitter. That's what we do on Twitter, I think. Don't follow me. So, or in this case, organizations. The second thing is we've been asked by some people who are willing to pay for their attendance here today to make a donation, how they can do that. And Mariana Rodell is right here. She is the keeper of donations. We can get you a receipt if you need that for expense claims or what have you. So Mariana will be at the student chapter table just after this session, or you can come down and find her if you are able to pay for your attendance here. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Tina now for our keynote speaker. I'll just pull up his slides.
Okay, thanks very much. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Pajor as our keynote speaker for today. But before I do the introduction, I'm going to first acknowledge the support of the University's Federation for Animal Welfare, UFAW. Their LINK program has been a regular funder of our keynote speakers for our annual research symposium, I think, since its inception. And so I wanted to acknowledge UFAW as a sponsor of this part of our program. Now, to introduce that, Dr. Ed Pajor is the Anderson-Chisholm Chair in Animal Care and Welfare and a Professor of Animal Behavior and Welfare in the Department of Production Animal Health at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine, University of Calgary. Now, Ed is actually a native of Ontario, grew up in Brantford area,
close by,
there, and did his undergrad at Waterloo, so he is a neighbor here, and then completed his master's and PhD at McGill University. He worked in agriculture and agri-food Canada for some time at Lennoxville, and before returning to Canada, he was on faculty at Purdue University in Indiana in the Department of Animal Sciences for several years. Ed's recognized internationally for research on a number of farm animal species, as well as new work in the area of rodeo, and he has served on a number of journal advisory boards, editorial boards of Journal of Animal Science, Applied Animal Behavior Science. In addition to his scientific achievements, Ed is a regular contributor to policy groups developing standards for animal care and welfare, including being on the scientist committees for codes of practice. You were on 3, so we're tied.
I didn't know it was a competition. If I would have known.
We're all in great demand. And also with McDonald's Global Animal Health and Welfare Team, National Pork Board, and the U.S. Animal Welfare Committee, Certified Humane to name a few. So it's a great pleasure to have him here today to talk to us and joining and welcoming Dr. Ed Pajor.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you, everybody, for the invitation, to the organizers for the invitation to be here today. And my goodness gracious, what a fantastic turnout, and what a great group of presentations we've already had this morning. So, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. See, for a minute there, I thought I was back in my classroom for some reason. I don't know why that was. What I'd like to talk about today is some drivers of change for animal welfare. There's lots of different drivers of change of animal welfare. And here's a whole list of things that I've talked about in various classes and various places talking about future drivers of animal welfare. Now, Derek said I really don't have 3 hours today, so I'm not going to talk about all of these things, although I probably could and just do it a lot faster. But I won't. I'm going to really focus on a few of the items that are on this list. I'm going to focus on attitude and perceptions. I think we all live in a world where attitudes and perceptions around how we treat animals and what we use animals for has changed a great deal. And we need to do a better job of understanding that. Very briefly going to mention standards and assessments, education and outreach, as well as focus on science and research and some of the research activities that we're doing at University of Calgary. Derek in particular asked me to emphasize the research activities that are going on because given that this is a research symposium, I thought that was the best way. But all the other things on the list are important as well and important to different people. And I think the list just keeps growing in terms of what's happening with animal welfare. But let's start off talking about attitudes and perceptions. And I think there's two components to that. You know, start to understand the public and the consumer, as well as understanding the producer. I think there's been a lot of work done on looking at the public or consumer perceptions around animal welfare. This is a Gallup poll result from 2015 that asks the questions about which of these statements comes closest to your view about the treatment of animals. They deserve the exact same rights as people. It's still appropriate to use them for the benefit of humans, but they need some protection, or they don't need any protection at all. They've asked this question a number of different times, 2003, 2008, 2015. The number of people that think that the animals require some protection has actually decreased, right? So the number has gone from the 71, 72% down to 62, but you see that increase in the treatment of animals actually being the same as humans. So that increase was the big news story when Gallup released this poll, suggesting that there is quite a big shift. A lot of other studies done in the United States and other places in the world show similar type of results. More and more people care about how animals are raised for food. There's a recent result out of the Eurobarometer study project that was done in 2015, 2016, and a whole bunch of information I think is developing in Europe on a new EU platform around animal welfare. I don't think they quite have it together yet, but the story seems to be the same. Here in Canada, through Food and Farm Care Ontario, you've had this wonderful relationship with the Centre for Food and Food Integrity down in Kansas, I believe is where they're based. You see pieces coming out in this particular study, a particular report. Animal welfare didn't play a huge role in what people were replying to. They did have some concerns around genetically engineered crops and animals, but they also had the statement, the result that animals should have the same rights as humans. About 25% of the people that were interviewed actually seemed to agree with that statement or said that that was the case. When we look at other studies, so UBC, Jeff Spooner's work in 2014, he looked at a number of different attitudes. He looked at consumer attitudes. He looked at a number of different commodity groups. He looked at swine producers, beef producers, dairy producers, looking at towards their attitudes around animal welfare. This one here around Canadian consumers said that they had a strong preference for natural environment. They opposed a single focus on animal health at the expense of natural living. Those of you who are in vet school should take note of that there is some concern that health isn't necessarily the most important component when it comes to some of these issues. The support of humane handling, small family farms, opposition to confinement, and they had strong objections to animal suffering and pain associated with production methods. And I'm going to focus a fair bit on the pain aspect because a lot of the work that we've actually been doing in Calgary focuses on pain. More specifically, when you looked at the actual pain and attitudes around pain, participants often cited affective states when defining animal welfare, stressing the importance of animals remaining free from pain and fear, stress, suffering, and loneliness. People were talking about positive welfare or happiness of the animal. It's one of the most exciting areas in the science of animal welfare, is trying to understand the positive emotional states of animals. Historically, in animal welfare science, people have been focused on decreasing suffering, eliminating pain. People haven't been looking at allowing animals to have happy lives, right? Or the positive emotional states. One of the reasons for that is because we haven't had the tools to do so. And one of the reasons we don't have the tools to do so is that funding for basic research in animal welfare science is hard to get. And trying to convince people that we want to look at developing good scientific tools to look at positive emotional states, it can be a challenge. Right? It's a hard way to find funding, and some people do, and you have some people here on campus that do that. Freedom from pain was, again, further emphasized. So remember this, okay? Consumers care about pain and suffering, right? And it makes sense, right? They've all had headaches, right? Try to convince people that there's something wrong with a housing system for an animal, like poultry or swine. I've done a lot of work on swine research and gestation-style housing, for example. People don't like the idea, but do they really understand it? The evidence seems to be not really, because they don't really understand what a housing system is. Pain, suffering, they get. Right? They have pets that experience pain and suffering. So they get animal pain, or at least some idea around animal pain. It matters to people. So let's contrast that with what happens in the Canadian beef producers' attitude survey that Jeff Spooner did as well. Canadian beef producers said that invasive procedures, branding, castration, dehorning, they recognized as being painful, but they were accepted as being necessary for regulatory management reasons. So some cases you have to brand animals to send them into the United States. For example, that's where you're sending them. It's a legal requirement. Satisfactory trade-offs to prevent worse welfare problems such as aggression. So castration is often the argument that's put forward there. And it's short-term and it's relatively unimportant. The animals recover fairly quickly. You don't see huge decreases in growth rates. So it's a very short acute pain, and it doesn't really seem to be that important. We found the same thing in some of the work that we've done. So Melissa Moggy just finished up her master's program, and she did a mixed method looking at these practices associated with cattle pain. So she did actual going out and seeing what people did, filling out surveys, and doing a qualitative type of approach to looking at this whole issue. And it's kind of the same type of thing. When we look at perceptions of pain, and what we have here is a number of different types of practices such as castration, dehorning, etc. Farmers recognize that these things actually cause pain. It's kind of a no-brainer in their minds that of course it does, really. So you don't really need more research to show that branding causes pain, right? I mean, this burning hot skin, and you look at people and they will look at you and say, duh, of course it does, right? But they're still not doing very much about it. When we asked them what they were doing when it came to all these practices, and these are practices like I said, the C-section dehorning, etc. When we look at something like castration, the yellow are those producers that are actually using pain mitigation, okay, of any type. The answer is they're not doing very much, regardless of when they do the castration procedure. Dehorning, the yellow again, producers that are using pain management of some sort. Branding. So if we look at the right-hand side, we look at hot iron branding, 53% a hot iron brand. Of those 53%, only 4% of those actually use any type of pain management. We did this study about 3 years ago, was when we started collecting the data. And it was very easy to find producers to get involved with other studies where we weren't using pain management at all, right, at that point. It's really interesting, though, what's happened in the last few years. In the last few years, you've had new products being produced that farmers and ranchers can use for pain management. Products that are cheaper and products which are easier to give to the animal. Okay? We right now are trying to recruit ranchers on a study, and we're having problems finding anybody that's not using pain management. Right? Here's the big role of research, right? You have to do that basic research. You have to develop the drugs. You have to find a market. You have to make it cost effective. And surprise, surprise, if you make it easy to do and cost effective, producers use it. Ranchers use it. Right? It's simply astounding. The people that we talk to around Calgary, it's like, well, we really want to do a study where we give an NSAID to this group, but we don't give an NSAID to this group at processing. And they look at us and say, no, we're not interested. Right? We're giving it all to our animals, and are you sure it works? I don't know for sure, but we think it's better. Animals are up and moving faster. We're going to use it anyway. Which just goes to show that, again, if you give producers tools which meet the certain criteria where they can use them, they will use them. Right? But remember, let's go back to Spooner's study. So we've got this data that says we don't use much pain management, or pain management is acceptable. And we have this consumer concern. You can see the tension, right? You can sense that there's a tension between what consumers want and what producers are actually doing. And that's where we come to the whole issue of social license, which you've heard about earlier today, right? Social license, the privilege of operating with minimal formalized restrictions, right? The huge issue around social license is public trust. Okay? If you don't have trust, you lose social license very easily. Okay? Because people don't believe that you care the way they care. They don't trust you. Now the problem is, and the studies have shown this, is that when it comes to what drives consumer trust, it isn't a skill set. It isn't being a good scientist and having good data. Right? That's not what drives consumer trust. What drives consumer trust is the whole issue of shared values. Right? If people believe that you share the same set of values that they do, they are much more likely to trust you. It just makes sense. Right? If you know somebody, you trust them more than a stranger that you just met. Right? So, this is a problem for scientists and for veterinarians. Because people ask us a question, and we tend to give them an answer. They want to know about what's the right way to raise an animal, and we give them data and p-values. Right? We don't say we care. We care about how those animals are raised. It's important. Scientists have shied away from saying animals have emotional states, right? That animals can experience pain and suffering. Right? We know that's true, but scientific training stops us from going down that path as easily as maybe we should, to open the door for discussion. Okay? What does it all mean? It's that famous Theodore Roosevelt quote, nobody cares about how much you know until they know how much you care. Once they know how much you care, then you have the door open for discussion around the scientific issues. Right? And I'll challenge you with that. When I start talking about rodeo, I'm sure, because I'm sure there's people in this room that think rodeo is just simply evil, right? And they've already made up their minds about certain things. And I want to talk about keeping your minds open. So, we need to show people that we care, that we share values. One of the ways we do that is by developing sets of standards. Standards and legislation. There's a number of different standards that have been developed, such as the Code of Practices for beef cattle, dairy cattle, lots of other species as well. We have a whole range of standards that are starting to happen. We have on-farm animal welfare assessments that are happening. This is one of the more recent ones. It's the Canadian Feedlot Animal Care Assessment Program. It's actually put up by the National Cattle Feeders Association. I think it's the only on-farm animal welfare assessment program which is PACO certified, which is the Professional Animal Auditor Certification Organization based in the US. It is considered the gold standard for animal welfare or on-farm assessment programs. What it is they're an organization that audits the audit you're using, right? So it's making sure that the audit meets a certain level of standard around animal care and animal welfare. When organizations such as McDonald's and other organizations start asking questions about what program are you going to use to assess animal welfare in your system, they're very happy to hear that you're using a PACO certified system, a PACO certified auditor, and it's a third-party audit. No other connection to the organization. That's kind of the gold standard for any type of auditing system, and it applies to animal welfare just the way it does to lots of other auditing systems. But there's been an awful lot of discussion around codes of practice, on-farm audits, pro-action, all those types of programs. Those are good things. But I don't think that's where the future's taking us. I think the future's taking us in a different direction or down a slightly different path, and I think that's where there'll be opportunities for you in terms of research. I think the thing that's really growing is sustainability. We have a number of different organizations. So you have things like the Unilever, for example. Anybody know who Unilever is? Largest producers of groceries in the entire world or something like that, right? Unilever has a sustainable agricultural code. In the Sustainable Agricultural Code, there is a chapter on animal welfare and animal care. Within that, it is very clear that they expect their supply chain to make their producers accountable for animal care practices. It's just one thing in the sustainability process. We have things like the Sustainability Consortium, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, etc. Sustainability Consortium, a group out of Arkansas, led through Walmart and some other organizations, has become an international sustainability group. These are some of the name brands which are associated with the Sustainability Consortium. The Sustainability Consortium focuses on things like sustainable energy, right? Energy use, water use, those types of classic issues. They also are looking at animal welfare, right? Because if something is going to be sustainable, it's got to be sustainable socially as well, right? If you carry out practices which animal welfare isn't part of the discussion, it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. Sustainability Consortium is just one of many different ones. Here's the Sustainable Ag Innovation Platform, really based in Europe rather than it is in the US. But again, you can recognize name brands. I've been to some of these meetings, and it is amazing the people that you have vice presidents of companies, they are learning about water use and energy use and starting to talk about animal welfare as being part of sustainability. I think moving forward, I think individuals who can kind of maybe take that One Health approach, or institutions that can kind of work on wicked problems and start thinking about sustainable ag production with animal welfare as part of the discussion are going to make a big contribution in the future. I want to talk a little about education and outreach. There's always an awful lot of discussion about educating consumers about what producers do on the farm. It's the classic issue of they would understand if we just tell them what we do. It's not really the case, right? But people are working hard to get that message out to consumers. Right? There's a lot of criticisms around agriculture, right? So we have propaganda and we have counter-propaganda that's occurring, right? But somewhere there's got to be some truth in the middle of all that, and I think people are starting to do a much better job of trying to filter through that. It's clear through studies, some done here at this institution, that consumers want to know more about their food than they ever have before. Millennials are different than generations that have come before them. How food is produced, et cetera, is something we hear about all the time, and people are asking questions about that. The truth is that they know very little about food production methods, and so that disconnect between caring about how your food is and actually understanding how your food is produced is a big gap that needs to be addressed. The one that I'm quite more interested in is the whole issue about addressing producers or ranchers, if you will. How do we reach producers and ranchers, right? How effective can some of the programs that science is informing and that are being developed, how effective can they be if we can't reach producers and ranchers? Right? When the codes of practice for dairy cattle first came out, a copy was sent to every single dairy producer in the country. Right? We looked at how many of them were actually aware that there were codes of practice. I think about 60% of them were aware in that first kind of 6 months after they came out. With ProAction and everything else that's happened since then, it's a completely different story. Right? So there had to be a lot more effort around the issue of making producers aware of what's expected of them. But again, it's another type of area that those of you who are interested in agriculture and are looking for ways of linking animal welfare to other aspects might be thinking about. Do we know how producers learn? What models of learning behavior can we use to make our outreach programs more effective? Right? Outreach is something that has disappeared in a lot of the kind of provincial programs where there used to be many more outreach and extension offices. That doesn't really exist anymore. So how do we get that information out? Okay. This is just an example of the theory of planned behavior. It's been applied in Europe, looking at understanding farmers' decisions with regard to animal welfare, why you change from a group housing system, why you change to a group housing system. So it just takes you through, the whole point here is really just to say, there's information out there about how people learn, right? But I don't think very many people have yet applied it to agricultural industry. So this is theory of planned behavior. This is another approach. This is the hard-to-reach dairy farmers, work done by Jansen. And she identified very different types of producers. So the do-it-yourself versus the proactivists, the wait-and-seers, and I like the reclusive traditionalist one. I don't like it when other people are looking into my farm business. I'm very much on my own. That's a real difficult group. That's a difficult group to reach with your scientific results. Right? They're not necessarily coming to meetings. Right? They're not really engaged in new activities that way. So how do you get the information to them? They're also the ones that are much more likely to probably end up on undercover video and things like that because they're not using modern practices. Right? But there's ways of taking what it is we know, and there's ways of understanding how farmers learn that we have to do more of. So I want to shift to talking a little bit more about science and research and the types of things we do. So we know that technological advances have always been part of what it is that drives animal welfare. It's still the case today. I think animal welfare has really expanded to include a broad range of disciplines, and I think that's a very good thing. I think at one time, historically, we would look at animal welfare and it would be psychologists, maybe some ethologists, but other practices weren't really involved. Right? Now you have people doing everything from molecular biology, genomics, proteomics, immunologists, veterinarians are much more involved. Social scientists, economists are all involved with the discussion around animal welfare. That's a good thing. Right? And what that is also opportunities. Right? As people looking for opportunities to do research, working with very different disciplines allows very different doors to be opened and insights to be found and approaches to be identified. One of the things that science has done is that they have identified general principles for the welfare of animals in production systems. And that was recently published in the British Vet Journal, or the Vet Journal in 2013. I think there's an element with all the different disciplines getting involved, everybody asking the question, and retailers getting involved, and all kinds of different organizations getting involved, saying, everybody asks the same question, and I don't know, I'm sure people here get the phone call all the time that says, so what is animal welfare, and how do you assess animal welfare? And it's like, oh, here we go again, right? One of the nice things about this paper is it does identify some of those general principles. If you look at the names of the authors on that paper, they're from all over the world, and they're some of the leading people in the area of animal welfare science. What they did is they identified a number of different general principles, starting with genetics, the environment, social behavior, feed, water, air quality, disease, parasites, handling, knowledge and skills, as well as pain management. Where painful procedures cannot be avoided, the resulting pain should be managed to the extent that available methods allow. Those of you who are students and are looking for some guiding ideas, it's a really good paper to get started in and to get looking at. And I think it's published in Vet Journal on purpose, I think, as trying to address audiences that may not be actually aware of some of the research that's been done in the past around applied animal welfare science. In terms of scientific emphasis, in terms of research in the future, I see that I would suggest that the emphasis is going to be on the emotional states of animals, positive in particular. I think there's going to be much more research, much more requirement that we do more than just alleviate suffering. Surely we can do better than just get rid of suffering. Right? Surely we can actually come up with a way of making animals' lives better. Now, is that cost effective? Will people pay for it? All those type of policy discussions is a different issue completely. Right? But the research question of understanding emotional states, I think, is a very important one. You can't do it necessarily in a vacuum, but you can't even start to address the issue if you don't have the tools to address the issue or to ask the question. Right? When we come to pain, I think pain's a big deal. I think every one of the codes of practice scientific committees that I was on identified pain as a leading cause, and it was probably true in the number of ones that you were involved with as well, Tina. So I think it's a big issue, and we need to learn how to manage it better. We need to have tools to manage it better. I think importance of natural behaviors, there is this real desire among people, or not desire, I should say, a real belief among much of the population that natural is somehow better. Right? That's a value that people have, rightly or wrongly. They identify that natural is somehow better. And if it's a natural behavior that you're allowed to happen, that's a good thing by allowing it to happen. There's lots of other discussion around that, but I think that's going to be a push that comes maybe from the social side. And genetics and genomics, and I'm not going to talk about genomics and animal welfare today. That's a completely other talk. Emotional states of animals, right? We've got lots of grimace scales that have now come out. They're the hot new thing that I think, a couple years ago, I think almost every talk at the International Society of Applied Ethology had somebody doing a grimace scale or some sort of qualitative assessment around animals. The pig one is out, sheep one is out, horse one is out, mouse is out, a bunch of other ones I'm sure are starting to come out that I don't know of. It's a good tool, right? It's a start. I think it has a lot of challenges. We had a faculty member that was working on mice and grimace scales quite a bit, and he's now moved to St. Hyacinth, but there are an awful lot of challenges. It's not quite that simple, right? Anybody here try to use grimace scales? Does it work that well? A lot of nervous laughter in the crowd. Yeah. So don't believe them, right? Don't believe them. Don't believe your own research. I never believe the results of my own research anyway, so don't believe the results of your research. It's like, that can't be right. I must have done something wrong. New technology plays another role as well, right? So we can have technology that allows us to measure things like feed intake. You saw a lovely talk by Megan this morning about trying to detect illnesses early on. And so if we can actually have technology that allows us to monitor things in real time, allows us to identify shifts from what is normal, allows us to come in and treat animals sooner and better, that's a good thing. And there's just going to be more and more of that, right? I mean, real-time monitoring of behavior is something that's so cool what's happening with some of that stuff. There's going to be much more of that actually going on. Again, Megan gave a presentation this morning looking at automatic milking herds and that early detection. The one thing that we had also as part of that is a kind of a companion study. So this is from a dairy cluster grant that Trevor and I wrote together. Trevor served on this committee and I served on Megan's committee. We actually took an approach of looking at animal welfare, looking at producers who adopted animal automatic milking systems and asked the question about what were their challenges, how do they address those challenges, what their view of the new system was it good for animal welfare or not. So you end up with a kind of a companion piece of looking at the technology and kind of hard data around milk production and illness detection, as well as dairy producers' perspectives around the use of new technology and kind of bringing that together. So kind of, again, expanding the question beyond simply how do we produce more milk or how do we detect a disease. There's no question that animals feel pain, right? Does everybody agree? Anybody disagree? Anybody not sure? I'm not going to embarrass you by having answers. Okay. My experience is that many people, very few people believe that animals don't experience something associated with pain, or at least some sort of ability to detect a noxious stimuli. So there's a bunch of things that we do on farms that cause pain in animals. And it's one of the areas that, again, is such a main concern around how consumers feel about animal welfare and agricultural practices that we've been doing quite a bit of research on that. These are just some examples of approaches we take to looking at pain. So you can look like an infrared thermography camera by Hans Kutzi on the top from Iowa State when he was at Iowa State University, looking at different levels of blood flow during castration. The bottom left pictures of an animal with a heart rate monitor. You can see the hunched body position. Just a reminder me to tell you about animal behavior being an important component to it. Strain gauges on loading chutes, so we can see how much an animal struggles, pushes, tries to get away. This is work that was done by Joe Stuckey and Karen Schwarzkopf-Genschwin. Karen still uses this type of chute in the work that she does, that we do together on pain and castration. So again, different techniques to look at pain. Brain waves, you can see the change in brain waves going from one side before castration to the after side, so we're getting better at looking at what the animals might be experiencing that way. Pressure ergometers, and the bottom right-hand picture is just to remind you that biomarkers, especially the molecular level, neuroscience type biomarkers, are areas that people are really working on. Not so much in animals, I don't think. I might be wrong about that, but there's an awful lot of work being done in human medicine. on that issue because we don't have very good ways. There's no gold standard for measuring pain. We're using all kinds of different things. So we're looking for more specific biomarkers. Once that happens in human medicine, it won't be long before it moves over to vet medicine or vice versa, depending on who's doing what. But again, a role for some real basic fundamental research to help us understand what animals are experiencing, and then we can take it and apply it to see whether some of our approaches to deal with pain are actually being addressed. Some of the work that we've been doing around castration in beef cattle, this is Daniela Melinda Suarez PhD work. This is just a classic old style type of picture that she has. But we're looking at assessment and mitigation of the acute pain associated with castration of beef cattle. When we did the beef scientific review, and Derek was part of that scientific review, it was clear that although everybody in the literature says that what we should do is really castrate animals as young as possible, there's some good logical reasons for that, there really was essentially no data to support any of that discussion, right? So although it could make some logical sense, what is the best way? How should it be done? What type of pain management could or should be used? What type of ages should be looked at? All those questions weren't there. The general idea that younger is better, but what does that actually mean? So Daniela has a number of projects. One is looking at acute pain at 3 different industry relevant ages. Those are young ages. I'll come to that again later. Looking at using meloxicam prior to castration. Looking at it in terms of 2 painful husbandry procedures, castration and branding. Looking at what does it mean in terms of when you should administer it, how early can you administer it to have an impact, have an effect. The big challenge, as many of you know, around castration or pain management around castration is the idea of double handling animals. We know that the most painful part about castration is the cutting of that spermatic cord. And essentially, if you want to deal with that, you have to give the drug early enough to have that impact. But that requires double handling, which can be a real big issue. We've shown that you can do it in swine fairly easily, just by changing the technique within the farrowing room. There's ways of doing that. With cattle, it becomes a little bit more of a difficult problem because you do have to move them through the handling chute. They're big animals. A lot of animals get hurt moving through the chute, and that's a real concern. We end up with animals that just hit things and bang things and those types of things. So double handling is something that rightly or wrongly is a concern that we often hear about when it comes to using this. So we wanted to look at that type of issue. And then we were just looking at meloxicam and lidocaine together. Just to go back to the first project, looking at that acute pain, just to give you an idea of the type of things that we're doing. We're using the same type of model for a number of the different projects that we're doing. We're looking at the age and method of castration that causes less acute pain and distress. So there's 2 different focuses. One is on the acute pain, one is on the chronic pain. We have a postdoc student looking at the chronic aspects of the pain. So younger ages, according to everybody, should cause less pain than older ages. We're looking at a number of different measurements to give you an idea. It's kind of, when it comes to pain, since there isn't any type of real gold standard, because we don't know what to be looking for necessarily at different ages, because we had the talk earlier today about trying to balance for age within a project, because we thought there might be differences in that. So we're looking at lots of different types of physiological measures, as well as a number of different behavioral measures, and trying to look and see what's actually coming out at different ages. The 3 different ages we were looking at is a week, 2 months, and 4 months. And we looked at control, band, and surgical. Now, you can't do a project like this and compare across ages, right? You have to compare within the age. Right? So you can't answer the question, is it different at the different ages? Because, well, the animals are different. The way you do the procedure is likely to be different, right? You can't really tackle a 4-month-old beef calf and castrate it on the field. It's not safe, and nobody would do it that way anyway. Everybody would run them through a chute and probably use a tip table for animals at that age. It's just much easier to do it that way. The 1-week-old animal, you can castrate when you go out to initially vaccinate them, tag them, and you could castrate them at that age. And you could do that by physically holding them down, right? So if you try to compare across ages, or compare one age to each other, you've got a whole bunch of confounding factors that won't allow you to do that. So within each one of these ages, we have our different groups, our control, our band, and surgical, and we're comparing those within each one of those ages. Number of samples taken, again, this is acute pain, so on the first day and then a week after castration was actually done. So what we found actually was that when we look at the results for 1 week, 2 months, and 4 months, very few physiological differences were found at 1 week and at 2 months. We were really confused as we were getting some of the information coming in and some of the data. The physiology results didn't seem to be what's already published and out there for older animals. Right? There's something very different that's happening. We don't know exactly what it is. Maybe through behavioral responses you could convince yourself that they're similar, or that they don't display as much when they're a week old, when they're in the hider stage versus when they're older. Right? You can have those types of differences. But physiologically, we also found very, very few differences at the 1 week mark and the 2 month old mark. And 1 weeks were very different from other animals when it came to some of the behavior work as well. What Danielle has concluded is that with the evidence for some of the cortisol and the behavior stuff, she thinks the band castration at 1 week of age produces less acute pain than surgical castration. So again, she's looking at that acute phase and not necessarily the chronic phase, which was when you might see the band having more of an effect as it cuts through the tissue. So we also have a couple of postdocs working on different issues. We've got on-ranch association between animals using GPS and drones. So if you manage the pain of an animal after castration, does it have an impact on bonding and how much time animals spend with each other? We have a bunch of projects happening with wound healing. Dr. Sonia Marty is leading those. And it's really interesting to take a look at wound healing because we're trying to decrease, onset of infections and those types of things happening when those animals go out on ranch. You have to remember that in a beef system that we have in Canada, you will be calving the animals at the barn and then sending them out to the ranch, and you probably won't see them for another couple months. You'll have cowboys out riding the ranch and looking for problems and those types of things, but they're not under the same level of daily supervision that you have in other production systems for other commodity groups. Again, we're looking at the use of meloxicam and pain management when it comes to wound healing. We're looking at a lot of those same variables, but we're also studying things like infrared thermography on wound healing rates, swelling of the wound, but a number of physiological and behavioral measures. We also did a study where we looked at topical healing agents. You'll see producers are often told to use item X that helps in terms of the wound healing part of things. The numbers, we looked at 3 or 4 different ones. The data basically says none of them really worked at all. So it's kind of like no one's actually studied them to see whether or not it had a major impact on wound healing. So it's a topic that we're kind of interested in to follow up on. Other work around pain of inflammation associated with calvings. Jennifer Pearson's working on that project. It is a one again where we're using meloxicam for animals that are pulled. She's looking at certain biomarkers. She's assessing pain and inflammation with and without the NSAID, and we're trying to look at calf health practices as well. So in terms of the type of the work that she does, a lot of the work that she does is much more physiological than it is behavior. We have a little bit of behavior that's done in that first week, but really what happens in our system, University of Calgary, we don't have a research farm. So we have to work with the ranchers and out on the range and those types of things. So when a producer or a rancher keeps a calf in a barn for a day, that's our window to get our behavioral results. And most of the time they lie there and just wait to be mom, let them suck and things like that, right? And there's other cows coming in and out, and it's kind of a crazy type of place in terms of having good control studies, but it's what we have to work with. So we can take a lot of physiological measures in that first day or two. She's doing a lot of work on that. This year she's done, that was kind of a very intense study on a ranch, doing lots of samples. This year she's gone out to, I think, 14 or 15 different ranches around Alberta, looking at the role that something like meloxicam will have on dystotic calves. So calves that have been pulled, and we've convinced ranchers to either give a placebo or give an NSAID, and then coming back and looking at growth rates and how well mortality rates and those types of things. So kind of more long-term studies on a number of different ranches. The final study we're doing is looking at cow-calf bonding and managing pain. So again, one of the things I'm interested in is this cow-calf relationship. We often look at, and veterinarians in particular, beef veterinarians will look at the calf in terms of how well it survives. It makes sense that that's where the issue would be. But I think that we often forget about the mom. We often forget about the cow having just had a hard pull done to it, and is it having any impact on cow-calf bonding formation? This is Annalise Heinrich. Annalise is a graduate of OVC, and she did a master's here as well with Suzanne Millman when Suzanne was here, I believe. Right? So Annalise is now my PhD student, and she's working on developing the whole issue around that. And we're doing some survey work. I work with an awful lot of epidemiologists, so I seem to have surveys always happening around me, which is kind of a fun thing that's happened since I moved to the University of Calgary. I worked in an animal science department before, and now I work at a vet college with lots of epi-type people, and that opens up a whole new area of research and activities. So we're looking at the role of pain, but the other thing we're actually quite interested in at the moment is looking at the role of oxytocin and seeing whether giving intranasal oxytocin will actually pass the blood-brain barrier, which is the first question, because oxytocin, in order to impact bond formation, has to cross into the brain. And the second is that if it does, and some studies suggest that it should, at least some of it should, does it have an impact on bond formation? So can we deal with questions like mismothering, when a cow simply rejects a calf? Can that be a treatment that's used on farm so that the cow-calf bond formation actually forms? Is it an issue that helps things like fostering a calf? So mom has died or rejects it or has twins, and you need to foster that calf somewhere else. Can we use something like oxytocin to deal with that? So those are the types of questions that we're kind of just starting and just launching on there. I want to also talk a little bit about the research work that we do with the Calgary Stampede. And I love these photos because it kind of suggests I might actually do something when I'm there. It's not true. All the work is done by hardworking summer students and other graduate students that are working on the project. But we decided to, I got involved in the Calgary Stampede. This falls into the category of you never know what's going to knock on your door. Okay? So the Calgary Stampede came to me when I first came to University of Calgary, and they asked me to be involved in the Animal Care Advisory Panel. So they had an Animal Care Advisory Panel helping them develop policies within the Stampede to address animal care issues. And so I was involved with that, but after a while it became very clear that none of it was actually based on any type of research. Because guess how many people do research on rodeo animals? Not very many. Guess how many people do research, and this isn't just rodeo animals, let me emphasize that. The work I do is primarily on rodeo animals. But we use animals every weekend in some form of competition for something. Right? And we use different types of animals. We use horses to do team penning, for example, like to take a penning type of event, right? Or a cutting type of event. How many of us actually worry about the animals that are used, the cattle that are used in the event? Are they well looked after or not? Are there any guidelines for animals that are on exhibition? Right? How long should animals be on exhibition when you're at the fair? Right? We have guidelines at the university about how often we can use animals for demonstration purposes, and they need to have a rest. Do we have any of that for any of the other times we use animals on exhibition? You know, any of you been to a sheepdog trial? Yeah, those are pretty cool, eh? Anybody worry about the sheep? A few, right? Everybody tells me, don't worry about the sheep, they're fine, right? But it's still a question to ask around how we're using animals. We're using animals for any purpose. We have a responsibility to look at how those animals are being treated. Anyway, Calgary Stampede came to me and asked whether I'd be involved in the panel. There's not much research being done. I said, why don't we start doing some? And so that's what we tried to do. The question we wanted to ask really was, is the performance that you're doing aversive? Every group I talk to about animals that use animals in different ways will look at me and say, my animal loves to perform. Absolutely loves to perform, right? You know, the guy who goes to dog races will say, my animals get so excited when I turn down that gravel road to the dog trail, they start going squirrely in the back. Right? Talk to people at Spruce Meadows and they say, all the horses know when it's show day, when it's jumping day. They're up, they're prancing, their behavior is completely different. They're excited. Guess what? When I talked to people at the Calgary Stampede, they said, our animals love to buck. They get excited about performing, right? It's like, okay, let's ask the question. Do your animals like to perform? Asking whether animals like to do something is a very difficult thing to do, especially in the environment that we have to work in. So we decided to ask the question about whether or not it's aversive. Aversive behaviors we understand a little bit better. We can pick those up quite easily. The other types of behaviors about do they like to perform requires things like, I think, more motivation tests, more preference testing, those types of things. So we asked the question, is the performance aversive? This is something Temple Grandin came up to help us. She happened to be visiting, and we were at the Stampede and kind of developing projects. The first year we were there, we were looking at lots of different behaviors: eye whites, tail flicks, defecation, kicking, vocalization. You'll see a list later on. We were interested in the handling of the animals. You know, how many rodeos had I been to before I went to the Calgary Stampede? This many, right? And what did I hear? I heard that these animals were handled roughly. Guys are mean to them. They're freaking them out beforehand. That's all stuff that we look at in terms of handling of animals when we do audits at slaughter plants. Right? How are the animals moved? You know, what type of techniques are used? Do people use prods? Do they hit them, et cetera, et cetera? That's something we can actually measure, right? We also are looking at how quickly the animal is loaded, and we're interested in using infrared thermography. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. So we've got 3 planned papers coming out of the work that we've done so far. The first one's been published, Applied Animal Behavior Science, last year, looking at the bucking bulls, and I'll talk a little more detail about that. We want to look at novice and experienced horses prior to rodeo performances, and then the use of infrared thermography as a non-invasive measure of stress. Just to give you a little background on the bulls and what we've been doing with the bulls and some of the data from that paper, we wanted to describe the behavior of the bulls in the bucking events, what they did prior to the actual event. Working at a place like the Calgary Stampede is a real challenge, and that is that they're on a tight timeline of getting the event done and moving forward. They've got TV contracts, and it's a major national event, right? And they're not really that open to letting somebody like me come in and say, would you mind just holding up for a little bit while I catch a few samples of something, right? It's difficult to do, so we get really stuck with doing direct observation type things and trying to do the best we can. What we looked at here is we looked at the handling of the animals. So this is the animals moving through their holding pens, and the animals move through a loading chute. This gives you a better idea of what it is. That red line represents the alleyways. This is the animals back behind the Stampede in the morning, waiting to be used in the chutes. It's probably pretty early because there's not that many animals present yet. The bulls are in the background, horses are up front because they get used first, and they get moved back to holding areas and leave. But we would look at how these animals were handled moving all the way through the alleyway, and then look at the behavior before they perform. When we look at the frequency of handling behaviors during loading, the list of things that we looked at and measured is on the right. The vocalization, waving, hitting the animal, swinging the gait of the animal, prodding the animal. The good news here is that for the most part, there's a whole bunch of zeros. The animals just load, right? Very little handling is actually required at all. And there are some cases where you do have animals that require a fair bit of handling, and I think I know that bull that had to be, we had to worry about 12 times. That one just didn't want to go anywhere. Right? I mean, it's you see these people handle these animals. These guys, they have to be on their toes with some of these animals, and they're so good at what they do when it comes to handling. But this is what we found. I mean, we basically videotaped them loading and scored how often they did any of these behaviors, and it's kind of the story is that they handle the animals quite easily. The animals load quite well. What do the bulls do during behavior, or in terms of their behavior during loading? Balking, charging, kicking, running into fences. Again, the good news is that the animals, for the most part, there's a whole bunch of zeros. Right? This is difficult data to collect because the stampede runs for 10 days. Right? We get to kind of follow an animal in detail, like one a day, maybe two, if we're lucky. The first day is always a washout because, well, it's the first day of an experiment and it's a washout, right? That leaves us 9 days. Championship day, we don't do any research on championship day because we don't want to be accused of getting in the way of somebody making money or not making money. So that gives us 8 days of which we can actually look at one animal in detail, and that's once a year. So we don't have as much data as we would really like to have. But the good news here again is that when it came to what the animals were doing while loading, very few were performing anything like balking, charging, or kicking. Again, there were some, and I think number 5, the charging bull, as I think I know who that one is. When we actually looked at the animals in the chutes, we looked at behaviors that we thought were related to stress and fear, things like moving back and forth, things like elimination, eye white measures, pawing, kicking, head tossing, bucking. Again, the take-home message here is that, yeah, some of it happens, right? And we've got one animal that kicks 7 times while in the chute, waiting to be used, waiting to be ridden. But for the most part, we get a lot of zeros, a lot of ones. A little bit is happening. We do have animals that do respond, there's no question, right? But the majority of animals we look at, as Temple put it, they're just standing there with soft brown eyes. Now that doesn't mean that everything's fine, right? I mean, we have to be open to the idea that there's something called learned helplessness. Animals may simply give up and not behave at all in the chutes because they don't like what's going to happen to them. That's possible. But in order to study that, we have to go down a completely different path than what we're doing right now. So a few bulls displayed any agonistic behaviors. They really responded to people getting into their headspace in particular. There was a number of times I thought we as researchers were upsetting the bulls more than anything else because they're kind of head shy, they're not used to being around people, they don't like people necessarily. I don't know whether they like them or not like them, but you get the sense that they don't like them being around. You're coming up to an event and there's lots of people around. So I started late though, I get more time. So. And there is ways to actually improve bull welfare, and it has to do with how people are placed, right? If people are in places where bulls have to turn corners, it's just basic handling things, right? People are there trying to help, but they're actually preventing an animal from going around the corner, those types of things. So we're actually working with that. And the Stampede has been very good about responding and saying, how do we fix it? How do we make it better? Infrared thermography, we've used infrared thermography to look at eye temperature. It's been used in other species and other events for a non-invasive measure of stress. It was developed by I think the first idea of using it was by the US Army, right? And they were trying to catch people who were lying. You ever been caught in a lie? You ever feel your face go flush? There's a response, there's an emotional response, right? And that's what they're trying to pick up on, and there's a certain part of the eye that we can actually look at to see that kind of emotional response. We did the IRT work, and this is an example of the IRT work, and a picture of the animal. And that lacrimal caruncle area is the area with the red triangle that we're actually looking at in detail to look for the response. Our initial results were quite encouraging. We know through behavior observation that novice animals show more stressful behaviors, more fear-related behaviors in the chute than the experienced animals. So we would anticipate that eye temperature should be higher for novice animals. Our initial results suggested they were. We've done this now a few more times. We're not so sure. We're not so sure whether we can use IRT or not. It doesn't seem to be working quite as well as we had hoped. There's just so much noise and so much activity happening at a live rodeo. We don't know whether we have the right tool for that situation. Doesn't mean it can't pick it up in a more research-friendly setting, but in the environment we work in, it's pretty tough at this point to say from our data, we've got about 3 years worth of data, that we actually have anything to say about IRT. We have other equine studies that are going on. My colleague, Dr. Renaud Legolet's doing work with chuck wagon horses. He's looked at issues around heart arrhythmias. He's looked at the amount of force horses using chuck wagon races actually have to pull. It's surprisingly little once they get going, but those are 4 big animals pulling a fairly light wagon. And he's actually looking for troponin, which is a marker which occurs in heart attack victims in human medicine. And so he's trying to look at some of these animals have cardiac failure and arrhythmias, and he's trying to look at that as a marker for animals. Can you pick these animals out ahead of time? Can you identify an animal that has some sort of cardiac problem ahead of time or has had one in the past, and then eliminate it from use, right? So that we decrease the risk of anything happening. We've done some work looking at heavy horse pull. Heavy horse pulling events where the animals pull a weighted sled. What happens there is that there's different weight categories. There's heavyweights, lightweights, middleweights. What do people do that wrestle or box when it comes to weighing in? They decrease water intake, food intake, so they make weight, right? And once you officially weigh in, then you're okay. Happens with horses as well in this type of event. The cool thing about this project is that it came from the Stampede Committee, the Heavy Horse Committee, saying, we're worried about our animals that are being used in this event. We think they may be off food and water too long just to make weight. Can we do something to take a look at that? And so that paper has now been submitted. The answer is that, yeah, the animals do come in pretty light and to a certain extent dehydrated, but they recover incredibly quickly, surprisingly so. And then we're looking at bleeding, exercise-induced pulmonary hemorrhage in barrel racing horses, and Renaud's just published a paper on that. He's found that most of the horses used in barrel racing will have the bleeding that occurs in the lungs, but they seem to recover quite quickly, and it doesn't seem to impact their ability to perform, so they're looking at a number of different issues that might be causing it. But I think it's the only study done on barrel racing that's been done. We also do a few issues around management of animals back behind the stampede. You saw that picture of the animals back in the background. So we're asking questions about water use, and if you provide animals, historically you wouldn't provide animals with water before an event or after an event. You still don't do it before an event. After the event, we're looking at, it's a very simple, basic summer student project, looking at how much water is consumed, how much fighting occurs over water. This one is whether we had 1 drinker or 2 drinkers in the trough. Nobody's looked at the management of these animals after an event. Right? Does it make a difference if you give them water? If you give them water, how should you give them water? Really basic questions that if we're going to look after these animals, we need to be addressing. So, animal welfare has become integrated with all aspects of animal agriculture. New technology, research demands, expectations are going to rise. The drivers of change will increase. What's forcing the changes is going to change as well. The influence of change is also going to change. The people who are having an impact on how things are happening will change. And sustainability includes animal welfare. I think that one of the biggest drivers of change is going to be the people in this room. Congratulations for being here, for taking part, for showing an interest. Never forget that animal welfare is about the animal and understanding the animal. And we need to do that. And we need different approaches to do that. We need that basic scientific question approach. We need that applied approach to address the problem. It's not a one only, right? And you guys can have an impact of that. So I thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions if I have time. That's how you can reach us. We're looking for 4 or 5 grad students, just out of curiosity.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, please.
Sorry, my voice is a little raspy, but
Mine too.
I know for emotional, looking at emotional states in mice and rats, serotonin and dopamine is sort of regularly monitored to sort of look at those potential, the happy or positive instead of just the negative. Is there any work on, farm production or agriculture and looking at those neurotransmitters?
Yeah, people have looked at those, and they've actually looked at them not so much from the viewpoint of positive emotional states. I don't know whether you guys know of any. But people have looked at them in terms of looking at aggression in animals, so trying to decrease aggression in animals that are putting them together by giving them amino acid precursors to the development of some of those neurotransmitters. I'm not aware of any. That doesn't mean there aren't some, and there isn't some happening. I'd be surprised if there isn't, given the push on positive emotional states in animals, especially, and in farm animals. So people are using a lot of emotional valence and cognitive testing and that type of thing. But again, this is one of those issues about about forming collaboration with basic scientists, right? I mean, the opportunity to work across from an applied lab with someone who's a basic neuroscientist and have them involved in committees and stuff, fantastic opportunity. Completely different skill set and way of thinking about the world. Right? We often get stuck in our own departments and not really thinking broadly. There's reasons to do that. There's good reasons to do that, but there's other opportunities as well. Yeah.
I'm curious to know if the Calgary Stampede if they've made some changes to their events since you've been working with them.
Yeah, so one of the nice things about the Calgary Stampede is that they're a non-sanctioned rodeo. That means they're not part of the regular rodeo circuit which exists, and there's a professional rodeo association that deals with it. As a non-sanctioned rodeo, they can set up their own rules. Right? So what they've done is they've actually changed a number of rules for specific events. So they have specific rule changes for things like calf roping, steer wrestling, things that don't happen at other types of rodeos. They've changed things like we had the big flood that happened in Calgary, and they had to replace equipment, and so they replaced all of the bucking chutes with ones that are much, much better, much more expensive, but have a lot less holes in them. Animals don't get stuck anymore. Those types of things that used to happen. They have hired a PACO certified person to develop their audits. They do audits every year at the Stampedes, so third-party audits or second-party audits, where they go in and measure everything that's happening. And then they respond to what's found. So if what happens is that animals are balking at a particular location because of shade or because of the flooring or things like that, the balking creates problems. People want to load them, the animals don't want to go. You kind of create the situation where bad stuff's going to happen. They change those things. So they're very responsive to making changes that they can make. And they're under a lot of pressure to do so as well. Right? I mean, it's one of those things where you have to address those issues. But yeah, it's been good. They're very responsive.
You spoke earlier about corporate sustainability initiatives. And I can see how there's some overlap there between those initiatives and profitability, like reducing input expenses, etc. But with animal welfare, seems less so the case. Like, say you look at all these animals in intensive systems of care and housing, it would cost more money to give them anything resembling like a happy life. So you spoke also about like industry efforts to win consumer trust, and to me that seems like it could also be the counterproductive for that goal of they raising the bar on animal welfare. So I was wondering your comments on that and how you can motivate consumers to be willing to spend more to improve welfare.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of questions there. I mean, I think in terms of the sustainability argument, a lot of the work, as I said, is about energy use and water use and things that have direct economic impact, right? But also are of environmental interest. Animal welfare is much more difficult that way, but there is a clear, the message is clear. The retailers know that animal welfare is important, and so they can build it into the social sustainability part of sustainability, they'll do so. How do you convince consumers to pay more is a really difficult question. I don't know the answer to that other than what you do is what's happened in some European countries, I guess, where a simple legislation that comes in and says, this is what it's going to be. It's a much more regulated type of approach. So I wish I knew how you can convince people to not just talk like citizens when they're asked the question, do they care about animal welfare, but when they're acting as a consumer, to actually back up what they say as citizens. Because if you ask, that's the big challenge, right? If you ask people, are you in favor of animal welfare? Do you think it's important? The answer is yes. Right? And they believe that. They're not being hypocritical when they go to the grocery store. They're simply acting in a different capacity as an individual. They're acting as a citizen rather than as a consumer, right? You know, linking, I don't know. Stop there.
What's the rationale for not providing water?
So it's the same rationale as you would have with other athletes who are about to perform. So a lot of things like track athletes or people are going to put out a lot of energy, don't want to have a full stomach, don't want to have a whole lot of water. They think that they perform better. That kind of thinking goes to the animals that are performing at the Stampede as well. So, but that raises the question, right? If so, they eat before they come into the Stampede. They're only there for 4 or 5 hours, depending on the animal. The water issue is of much more concern from an animal welfare perspective because there isn't a lot of shade, as you saw in that picture in the background. And that's actually one of the areas we want to start looking at is the provision of shade for the day and saying, okay, will animals use the shade? I assume they will, but does it make a difference in their performance? That type of thing. So that's the logic that they use. I don't know of any data to back it up in terms of whether they actually perform worse or better. But again, it's one of those questions to ask, and maybe a way of getting at, you know, decreasing the need for water is to improve the housing by providing shade.
Thank you. I think that will, any questions? Any discussion at lunch?
Of course.
As they're well, that's great. And so we have lunch served, and we will reconvene at 1:35. Enjoy the please, and thank you.